Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Anne. His name is Hawk. This is my BFF, my road bird, my assistant producer. He hangs out with me while I research and put together all my videos. Say hey! One of my favorite things to do is to read old newspapers. Have you ever heard of the legend of Lake Tahoe? Lake Tahoe was home to the Washoe tribe for thousands of years. The legend speaks of a giant bird that lives deep in the lake with a hunger for human flesh. The story was told in 1905 from the point of view of an old woman of the Washoe tribe. She looked deep into the waters and said, "I will tell you about the Ong." The Ong was a giant bird, bigger than houses. Its body was like the eagle. Its wings were longer than the tallest pines. It had the face of a Washoe man, but was covered in thick scales. Its feet were webbed. Its nest lay in the center of the bottom of the lake. Out of the nest came all the waters which fill the lake. There are no rivers that feed the lake. The water that flows out sweeps back through the nest. Every plant, fish, bird, animal, or anything that got caught in the mesh of the nest stayed there as food for the Ong. He liked to eat everything, but best of all, he liked human flesh. Anyone who fell victim to the waters would never be seen again. Their bodies were carried off to the Ong's nest, and no morsel ever escaped him. Sometimes the Ong would fly up and down the shores, looking for anyone alone. He never attacked a camp, or when two or more were together, but no arrow could pierce his feathers, and the strongest spears couldn't even scratch the scales on his face or legs. But he couldn't help but be afraid. His toes had no claws, and he didn't have a beak, so he couldn't defend himself. One fall, the Washoe was making their last hunt before they moved to the valleys for winter. The chief had to pick the greatest hero for his daughter Nona's husband. His daughter was the most beautiful woman in the tribe. Every man wished he would be the one picked to be her husband. The last night, around the fire, each man would tell the chief his most noble achievement. The chief would then make his choice, and the women would join them for the wedding. The men had been looking forward to this for many years. The tribe became famed for their most reckless and daring acts, in hopes to one day be chosen to marry the chief's daughter. It was the morning of the last day, and a lot of meat and fish were being packed away for the journey. All were prepared for the events of the evening. The suspense of not knowing was exciting to everyone. Everyone was celebrating, except for the bride-to-be. She had already given her heart to a handsome young man who was too young to fight when the tribe last went to war. He wouldn't be considered without a heroic story, and wouldn't even be able to sit at the circle. He sat all day at the cliffs that hung over the water, far from laughter and shouts of the camp, waiting for the Great Spirit to hear his prayer and give him the moment he longed for. Finally, he sprang to his feet to curse and defy the Great Spirit whom he trusted. Before he could say a word, he saw the Ong circling high in the air. He waved his arms, and the Ong immediately swooped down, grabbed him, and flew back up into the air. Everyone saw the young man in the Ong's talons, A cry of horror from the camp was the sweetest note to him. They flew straight up into the air until they became a speck in the sky. When the bird would reach such a height, he would drop his prey into the lake so the current could sweep him down into the nest. The young man expected this and untied a long buckskin cord from his waist, tying himself firmly to the ong's leg. The clumsy feet opened, but the man didn't drop. The bird thrusted his head down to grasp the man in his mouth. The strong web on his feet sheltered the man. Every time the ong tried to get him with his teeth, the bird would free fall through the air, twisting and turning. The tribe watched in horror. They couldn't see that every time the bird opened his mouth, the man would throw poison arrowheads into its mouth. The arrows cut deep into the unprotected skin on the way down the bird's throat. The bird started rubbing his feet together and tried to get the man off his foot, this time plunging into the lake. But now its feet were tied, so it couldn't swim. It flapped around underwater until it thought the man drowned, and flew out of the water toward the middle of the lake. The poison arrows had already started to take effect. Darkness crept over the lake, and the bird vanished into the darkness. The women were in their huts by now, and the men sadly sat in the circle. The chief's daughter couldn't understand why the man did not drop, or why the bird was acting so erratically. She knew she could die with her love, though, so she paddled her child-sized canoe out into the middle of the lake. She kept saying his name to herself, Tahoe, my Tahoe. By this time, the women noticed the chief's daughter was missing and told the chief. The men went out in search of her. They came across the ong's giant body floating in the lake. Next to it, a tiny turned-over canoe. Slowly approaching the shore was the strangest craft that any ever floated on water. It was one of the ong's huge wings. The sail was the tip of the other wing. Standing in it, clasped in each other's arms, was the young Tahoe and Nona. Now Tahoe knew he was the hero that would marry Nona. The ong's nest remains in the middle of the lake today, and the drowning never rises in Lake Tahoe.
The next story I have for you is something I'm sure you've heard of. The Donner Party took a shortcut in winter that led them into danger. To this day, phantom voices and cries can still be heard, and ghostly figures still roam.
Spring of 1846, brothers George and Jacob Donner, James Reed, their families, and employees left Springfield. The group was headed to California after hearing all the gold to be found. The group reached Independence, Missouri in May. The group of 31 joined a wagon party that was also headed west. They traveled 650 miles in 6 weeks, making great time. The group split up at a certain point. The Donners, Reeds, and some others chose to go southwest to Fort Bridger. The shortcut was suggested to them by Lansford Hastings, who obviously wasn't a very reliable guide. The group was also advised against it by a friend of theirs that had just made the trip west to east and had used the shortcut. The rest of the group said no thanks and headed north to Fort Hall.
they would use the Oregon Trail to journey to California. George Donner was elected leader of the group. There were 29 men, 15 women, and 43 children in 23 covered wagons, which would take the group towards Great Salt Lake. The shortcut was supposed to take off 300 miles, but it actually added 125 miles to the journey in some of the toughest terrain. Hastings was actually supposed to lead the group, but ended up going with a different group back at Fort Bridger. As they started a new trail, they lost about 2 weeks crossing the impossible terrain. After gathering as much water and grass and such for the cattle, they entered the Great Salt Lake Desert. It was only supposed to take 2 days according to Hastings, but it actually took 5 days, and they lost a lot of oxen and had to abandon several wagons. The other party had already reached California. The Donner Party was racing to make it past the Sierra Nevada before the snow started falling. Doesn't this remind you of that game Oregon Trail? It also started in Independence, Missouri. One path is easy and fast. The other is practically a detour through hell. Anyway, it began to snow as they started scaling the Sierra Nevada mountains. They made camp near what is now Donner Lake. But the Donners had fallen behind for a bit. They stopped to fix a broken wagon, while the rest of the group made quick log cabins for shelter. The Donners made camp at Alder Creek in flimsy tents. The group found themselves stuck in a brutal storm. The storm accumulated 22 feet of snow. These are the trees that they cut down. It marks how tall the snow was. Cabin fever and hypothermia set in. They also ran out of food. The party started eating their cattle and horses, then their oxen. They even ate their dogs. A party of men, women, and children volunteered to scale the mountains for help. The terrain was impassable. Reed continued on horseback while his family and the others fell behind on the trail. The day Reed left, Mrs. Graves, one of her children, and Isaac Donner died. The remaining people suffered 2 days along the trail without food. But on the 3rd day, they decided to eat the dead. They started with the 2 children, and by the 5th day, when the rescue party made it safely through the Sierra Mountain Pass, they were shocked when they found the haggard party eating Mrs. Graves. Her breast, heart, liver, and lungs were already gone by the time the rescuers with plenty of food reached them. One group member said, "What would you do if you were watching your family freeze and starve, when you've already eaten the family dog, paws and all, and you knew there was protein out in those snowbanks?" The trail was so rough they could only take a few people each trip. When they reached the camp, there were hardly any people left. They still had to leave a few behind and said they could still feed off the bodies for about 10 more days. On their next trip back to the camp, they found Mrs. Donner laying near the huts, with her thighs cut away, and a saw laying next to her. They found Kaisberg happily eating his meal. He stated to the rescue party he preferred humans to cattle beef. The party quickly assumed Mrs. Donner's life was taken to gratify his appetite. A member of the rescue party said that this was his alleged statement at the time they found him. He was branded a cannibal. Today, this area is known as the Donner Memorial State Park. Residents and many others believe the area where the party was stranded is haunted today. One visitor said she felt a warm feeling and smelled a campfire as she drove closer to the Donner campsite. She walked into one of the cabins and heard voices, but there was no one else around. She said she started feeling confused, but also felt a sort of deja vu. People believe that one of the ghosts that haunts the park is Tasman Donner. A man was skiing alone close to the Donner campsite. He also felt a spell of confusion and became disoriented. He looked around and realized he was lost. A woman appeared and came up to him. He noticed she was dressed kind of funny. She led him to a camp where several other people were, near the trail where he was supposed to be. He turned back to the camp to thank the woman, but there was no trace of her, and no trace of the campsite that was there just minutes before. If that didn't make you think twice about taking shortcuts, I don't know what will. Thank you all for joining the little Ong and I. Say bye. Until next time.